Peter. Welcome, everyone. This is a special day today as we celebrate International Day for End to Racial Discrimination. I think all of you have made a leap of faith while joining Rotary or doing community service in your field or discipline. And I want to commend you for your service. But at the same time, I want to bring a very important fact in that we must consider in Australia. Australia is a diversified country. It's a country which has brought thousands and millions of immigrants from around the world. But we do have to do a reflection and soul searching in our journey as we bring immigrants to this country. And that soul searching is to do with who we are as Australians. As an Australian myself who migrated to this country 10 years ago, I do soul searching every day. And I think my understanding of Australian is a country which is inclusive of people from all backgrounds, the country that welcomes people from all ethnicity, the country that welcomes people from all nationalities. It's a home for innovation. There's some of the brightest minds from around the world comes here to innovate and then takes these innovations to the world, to every other nook and corner of the world. That's the Australian that we must be celebrating. In that spirit of inclusive Australians and global Australians, I want to welcome you on this special day. We have with us a very special speaker today, Peter, who would speak to you about the diversity in Australia, but also a reflection of his in his conviction as well as his work, that how does he feel the diversity works in Australia? And his critique would be very welcome. And then we will have a panel discussion today. On that note, I want to start this meeting with an acknowledgement to the country. I want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to acknowledge all the Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people in this room and outside. And this land have never been seized. It will always be Aboriginal. So thank you and warm welcome to you all for this wonderful gathering today. On that note, can I invite Charlie Allen, our President-elect, to introduce our guest speaker today. But I also want to acknowledge President David Hirsch, who is joining us today, and fellow Rotarians who are joining us from far and wide. And also we've got a guest from America and Virginia who is on a visit to Sydney. So welcome, Al, and welcome, fellow Rotarians. Charlie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sonu. Thank you for the introduction. Also, welcome to Rotarians and guests, and certainly a big welcome to our speaker today, Peter Mousaferiadis. I've had the good fortune to have a long-time professional relationship with Peter. And I think my first observation of Peter is that he oozes charisma. He's probably not going to appreciate me saying that, but that's the first thing that pops to mind when I think of Peter. He's absolutely delightful to spend time with, and he has this encyclopedic knowledge on diversity and sort of the history or the backstories of a range of cultures. Another interesting fact about Peter Mousaferiadis is he is a conductor, a musical conductor of orchestras. He is the founder and CEO of Cultural Infusion, and Cultural Infusion has developed the Diversity Atlas, which is now used by communities and organisations to get a read on their diversity. I'll leave it for Peter to talk about Cultural Infusion and the Diversity Atlas. You might think that conducting an orchestra and being a leader of a successful NGO are somewhat light years apart, or are they? I mean, I've never conducted an orchestra, but I can only imagine what it's like. I can imagine there would be some very big personalities. An orchestra would have a culture of its own. I'd imagine within that culture, there's a whole range of subcultures: the string section, the woodwind section, the percussion section. And within those sections are other subcultures, you know, cellists, violinists, bassists. And what is interesting with an orchestra, with all those, with that culture and those subcultures, is there is someone who stands in front and turns all of those subcultures into a thing of beauty, the music that emanates from the orchestra. So, and Peter is that person. And so now, I guess his work is similar. I think he's perfect to head Cultural Infusion. He stands in front of diversity within a community or within an organisation and turns it into a thing of beauty. Welcome to Peter Mousaferiadis. Over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie and Dr. Sonu, for that warm welcome. And it's interesting that you make the analogy between conducting and running a business. Back in the early 1990s, I studied symphonic conducting in Czechoslovakia before it divided, 8 months in Italy, and I spent about a short stint in South Bend, Indiana, at Notre Dame. And I'll never forget one of my Czech conducting teachers. He said to me, I'm not just going to teach you to conduct. I want to teach you the paradigm of conducting and how you can apply that to everything else you do. And it was very interesting because in many ways, that's how I, run the group of organizations that I'm working with. But I just wanted to share another story with you as well. And that's the story behind my moustache. In 2016, I was invited to Lahore to chair the International Conference on Culture there over a 3-year period. I visited the Museum of Lahore, and I saw these amazing Greco-Buddhist statues of these Greco-Buddhist statues that had a moustache similar to mine, and that became the inspiration for this moustache. But most people aren't familiar with Greco-Buddhism. So when the Greeks arrived in South Asia with Alexander, 326, I think it was BC, a lot of them had given up polytheism, and a lot of the descendants ended up converting to Buddhism. And a lot of those Greeks were the very first to personify the concept of Buddha, and they also became the protectorates of Buddhism. So the King Demetrius the First, the Second, the Third, the Greco-Bactrian kings, Menandros. There's an amazing story about this Greco-Bactrian king who conquered more cities than Alexander, and heard stories about this, a monk called Nagasena who had an answer to every single question. And they said he said that's impossible. So he ends up turning up with his chariot and golden chariot and 500 horsemen. And what ensues is this conversation, which became immortalized as the questions of King Milinda. And King Milinda ended up giving, or Menandros ended up giving up his empire to become a big proponent of Buddhism. So it's an untold story, and it's a story I've been told that I shouldn't be telling by the Archbishop, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop here in Australia. So, but that's the influence to my, to a lot of my thinking as well, because I think also in the Museum of Lahore, they have the very first bilingual coins in the world. On one side, the Greek, and on the other side, the Kharoshthi. So what does that tell you about how we approach encounters today? Because every encounter is almost racialized. So how do we start to synthesize these incommensurate cultural differences? And I think this is a question that comes up again and again and again, especially in the nation state, and especially in democracies, which generally favor the majority and have to find ways to also give a voice to those minor groups. So thank you once again for inviting me today. And Charlie, I've been a great fan of the work that you've been doing with the Global Peace Institute, and I'll talk to them in a moment. I think the last time I spoke at a Rotary event was in 2008 or 7, and I haven't spoken again since, and that was to talk about my work as a conductor, as a creative director of large multicultural events. I produced 9 Australia Day concerts for our state government here, as well as about 40 opening and closing ceremonies. So I'm really excited to be back, and I hope to be talking at Rotary events without a 15-year hiatus. Yeah, so today I'm going to be drawing on my experience, my varied experience that I've had, but more importantly, as the founder of several cultural enterprises, which are now delivering consulting services and data services to some of the largest corporations in the world, including the UN, AWS, Amazon, ADP, BDP, and countless others. I ask you to take note of the word cultural enterprise, and I use that word rather than social enterprise. And what I mean by that is, how do we begin to use market forces to motivate behavioral change and the change that we really need today? I also today in my talk, I want to sort of reframe how we think of diversity, data, the value of representation, and in particular cultural diversity, and how that intersects with March the 21st being the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. March the 21st is also a time where about 400 million Central Asians and some people from the Middle East celebrate Nowruz, which is New Year's Day. And ironically, yesterday, March the 20th, is also known as the International Day of Happiness. So whenever I think about my directions that I've taken in my life, I want to circle back to where I was born. I was born in the western suburbs of Melbourne, during the 1960s, and in the 70s, where it started to really diversify, especially in Newport, where I lived. A lot of migrants started to move into that area, and in many ways, living behind my parents' milk bar for the first 20 years, well, I moved there at the age of 4, so it was a major part of my life. Really exposed me to the other and the value in understanding the other as a way of being able to reinforce the self and understand yourself better. But going back, a little further, so if we go back to before Europeans, colonized Australia, in the late 1700s, there was an estimated 700 languages and speech communities that were spoken here. These represented more than 324 distinct ethnic groups, or what some might even describe as nation states today. So, Australia was always an incredibly diverse place. So before I established Cultural Infusion and all its brands, I spent, the better part of 2 decades working as a, conductor, composer, and creative director, producing, major, concerts, not only here, but across the world for clients such as the Parliament of World Religions, the UN, our state government. But at my final Australia Day concert in 2012, I was backstage with the most senior custodian of the city of Melbourne, Joy Murphy, the senior custodian of the Wurundjeri people. And I asked Joy, I said, Joy, how many thousands of people speak your language, the Woiwurrung language? And there was silence. She said, how many thousands? There's only one living person that speaks the language, and that's my auntie. So I ask you to take a moment and, just imagine if you were the final speaker of your mother tongue. What would that feel like? So the decimation of languages, cultures, and peoples in Australia is probably the greatest tragedy of our history. I also want you to cast your mind now back to, before I do that, I'd also like to maybe just acknowledge if there's any elders amongst us, and also pay my respects to, the people that make up this area of where I come from, the Woiwurrung, the Bunurong, the Djadjawurrung, the Taggurrong, and Wathaurong people who, came together, and this area was an important meeting place and location for not only cultural events, spiritual events, all types of different events. So I want to acknowledge the past, present, and maybe any sort of future custodians who are going to come afterwards. But I want you now to think of pre-1989. And that for me is a really significant time. Why? Because there was no World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. And in a period of around 3 decades, what did the world experience? Massive economic globalization without globalization of values and ethics. So we found ourselves in what a lot of people describe as this super diverse, this hyper diverse world where time and space became compressed. The world was a really small place all of a sudden. We became exposed to a myriad of cultures, ways of behaving and thinking. But did we have the ability to be able to relate to the other? So intercultural understanding has now become, in my opinion, a core value and a key competency of what it means to become a global citizen. The world now is beginning to reach this boiling point with all sorts of crises that are looming and all sorts of geopolitical implications, which are, snowballing and affecting every single one of us. But humans can be defined by two major words, and they both commence with the letter C, in my opinion. C for conflict and C for culture. Culture is overarching and underpinning. Every society has a culture, a way of thinking, a way of behaving. It has its social norms. All these guide society. So if we want to have social change, then we really need to change culture. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that social change is embedded in cultural change. So how do we start to switch the thinking around and recognize that culture needs to be an important pillar, an equal pillar that needs to sit alongside social planning, probably more important than social planning, environmental planning, and economic planning? You just hold that thought and let it resonate with you. Now let's look at conflict. According to the Global Peace Index, which was established by Stephen Killalea, the cost of conflict equates to more than 13% of the global GDP. I think it's around 13.5%. In terms of dollars, this is something like $14 trillion every year that's spent on dealing with the cost of conflict. Now, according to the United Nations and UNESCO, which I do a lot of work with, 75% of all the conflict we have in the world has a cultural dimension. So we're now talking about $10 trillion that's spent dealing with macro and micro conflict on an annual basis. Why aren't we investing more to understand culture? And this is what really drives what I do. And in the last 7 years, how I'm now beginning to take a data-driven approach to understanding who we are. I want to also circle back now to today, and how race and racism intersect. Interestingly, from a historical perspective, the idea of race is actually quite recent. Previous empires such as, the Greeks, Roman Ottomans did declare their supremacy as empires are wont to do. This was based on, religion, wealth, power. Previous civilizations did believe they were superior to others. They were not concerned, however, with people's skin color or other supposed biological differences. Race was not a concept until the birth of the American colonies, where white supremacy was written into law in order to subjugate the black slaves kidnapped from Africa and justify slavery. And let's keep in mind, there were slaves that were being transported all across the globe. I think the Arabs transported something like 15 million slaves. The British transported, more than 600,000 across the Atlantic. And if you go all the way back to, my ancestors, the ancient Greeks, in the peak of the golden age of Greece, something like 90% of Athenians were slaves. But the concept of treating slaves based on color was only a recent phenomenon. So take note, this is a particular form of discrimination, and we mustn't perpetuate language that reinforces dangerous non-truths. So it's a time now to drop, for me, the word race and racism, and maybe replace it with supremacism or other language that's really describing what's going on. Racism is not ubiquitous, and it does not describe all forms of discrimination. If we go to South Asia, for example, the likely type of discrimination is probably centered around religion or caste or even ethnicity. How often do we hear racism intersecting with other types of discrimination? Why is it important that we start to find more nuanced language? Why? Because if we can do that, then we can start to develop a whole range of intervention strategies, because now we understand what type of discrimination is taking place. So if we think of racism and more broadly discrimination being driven by fear and ignorance, how can we now begin to think of the counter drivers being familiarization, collaboration, and the role that education can play? And this is some of the work that I've been doing since 2002, and our Discovering Diversity program, which we've been delivering into schools to more than 300,000 students. It really focuses on trying to reduce ethnic and race-based discrimination through familiarization. But also, how can we start to begin to apply this concept of the positive and negative peace framework, which Charles is a great proponent of? So we can think of effective now anti-racism as being the institutions, the attitudes, the processes and structures that create and sustain inclusive and equitable societies, rather than the absence of racism, and actions to stop discrimination from taking place. So the same factors that create these settings also lead to many other positive outcomes that settings aspire to, including thriving economies, better performance on ecological and inclusion matters. How do we do this? How do we build these systems for an incredibly rich world? A world where we not only see biodiversity as essential for survival of our planet, but place equal emphasis on cultural diversity, which is also essential for saving our humanity. According to the United Nations, there's 193 full member states, 2 non-member states. There's about 55, 60 dependent territories, and a whole lot of disputed territories. Yet according to anthropologists and linguists, and a lot of the work that we've been doing and the database that we've built, there are more than 8,500 ethno-linguistic people groups, more than 8,500 religions in the world, and our Diversity Atlas has all this, and more than 11,200 languages and speech communities across the globe. What an incredibly rich world we live in. Now begin to intersect this cultural diversity against the myriad of other demographic dimensions of identity, such as gender expression, gender identity, biological sex, sexual orientation, age, even position type within an organization, position level. And what do you start to see? You can start to see where equity might lie in an organization, where it doesn't lie, but you also quickly recognize that we're all as unique as a fingerprint. Now I'd like to introduce some slides and speak to the value of how we can understand ourselves better, and by doing that, how that may begin to reduce ethnic and race-based discrimination and start to inform social policies that are failing across the world. Okay. 1 second. Share screen. Okay, so I'm going to speak to this slide first, and don't know if any of you recognize this famous statistician here. His name was Abraham Walt, and Abraham Walt escaped Hungary because of his Jewish heritage. He arrives in the US, and the US Defense Force quickly snaps him up because they recognize that this guy's got an incredible brain and he might be able to help us with all these bombers that are coming back riddled with bullets. So they wanted to speak to him about how do we start to reinforce these planes and reinforce them in the right area, because they weren't going to be able to reinforce the whole plane. And he says, you know what, you're showing me the wrong planes. I want to see the planes that are not coming back. So by doing that, by working out through a process of elimination, he was able to work out where the planes needed reinforcing. And this gave way to survivorship bias. How often do we make decisions, develop strategies, governments develop policies based on only the data they can see, maybe limited data, and how and what the consequences are of that? So, of course, what does partial data sets lead to? It leads to devastating outcomes. And the US Defense Force was clever enough to realize that they didn't have the answers and to bring someone from the outside who was able to think outside the box. There are many instances in history where, missing data has resulted in negative consequences. But let's now talk about diversity, and let's start to think about diversity in terms of metrics. If I was to ask all of you in the room what diversity is, or if you asked me prior to 2015, I would have given you some long explanation about diversity. But it wasn't until my CTO, Reza Mayini, who happened to go to a school for geniuses, and was a brilliant mathematician, he goes, diversity just means one thing. It means difference. And if it means difference, we can start to apply a whole lot of metrics to this difference. So he introduced me to these three concepts, or there's four concepts in total, but these three concepts. First one being variety, the second one being disparity, and the third one being balance. So let's look at each of these. So if you were to think of variety as being the absence of homogeneity, and you were to think of in a room there were 2 Italian and 2 Portuguese people, and in another room there was Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, and French, there would be greater variety of languages spoken there. We can develop an algorithm there. So we can start to now get a sense of what diversity looks like from a measurement perspective if we're just looking at variety. The second metric was balance, which looks at what does that distribution look like across an organization. And a lot of organizations out there will say, oh, we're extremely diverse, but you go into them as you go further north, there's less probably diversity, and there might be less gender diversity. Today, a lot of boards have worked so they can develop greater gender diversity. But if we start to do this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're just looking at it through one lens, rather than taking what we describe as this multifactorial approach, which intersectionality sits within, then we're going to start to create a whole lot of unintended consequences. And I'm starting to see myself sitting on boards where I'm the only person of a non-English speaking background, and there's gender parity. But beforehand, there may have been, 70% were men, 30% were women. And this is creating resentment in the community because people are starting to miss out. But also, if we look back at some of the work that the Human Rights Commission has done, and Tim Somapomasan in 2017, and he released the Human Rights report called Leading the Change, they identify that something like 97% of key leadership positions comprised of people from a Northern European background, not at all reflective of the 51% of the population. Now, I'm not saying that all key leadership positions should be totally reflective of the community, because that's not going to happen overnight. But there's a value in representation, and there's value in developing goals over a long period of time that you can start to work to, because when you do that, you start to build equity, you start to then see the benefits that come from diversity. And there are a myriad of studies out there that speak to the value of diversity. The last metric is disparity. This opened my mind completely for a lot of the international committees that I sit on. And this is looking at the dissimilarity of what we're looking at. So that second group that I talked about, the French, Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish, think now of another group that might be French, Arabic-speaking Japanese, and maybe Cherokee. The diversity there will be greater. Why? Because one's ethno-linguistic background shapes cognitive processes, shapes every single way we approach an encounter, shapes a smile, shapes language, shapes what we wear, shapes everything. It was interesting. The global DEI director of SAP recently, I was having a conversation with her, and she said, well, my identity as a Hindu person is more important than my identity as a woman. Why? Because it influences what I wear, how I think, how I approach people, what I eat, and so many other things. But the other metric I want you to start to think of is this concept of mutuality. And the genesis for this idea for us was the law of requisite variety, one of the principles of thermodynamics that states that any system, if it's not as equally as varied as the environment it's operating in, will create tension and probably eventually disappear. And this should be speaking today in this increasingly globalized world, should be speaking to every single organizations. There are organizations now struggling with this, and organizations that are facing this precipice, and it will probably disappear because they're not embracing their environment and the value that that brings. But start to think of the value that this can bring to certain sectors. Now, this is one example here that you can see on the slide, is in the health sector. And what we notice with hospitals that we're working with is that when hospitals have workforces that reflect the communities they're giving patient care to, those patients have spent less time in hospital, better health outcomes, they save money on translations, on interpreters, even less women die on the operating table. But start to think of the relationship between psychiatric assessments, for example. There's been a lot of studies done on this, where psychiatric assessments at the moment, which have been developed by the Anglosphere, are leading to misdiagnosis of a lot of, aged care patients that are entering hospitals. Think of the relationship between, ethnicity and health. Start to think of the relationship of, ethnicity and how that played out during the pandemic. So what is cultural diversity? Well, what we realized before we conducted 300 literature reviews, that cultural diversity was poorly defined. It was a blurry space. It had been analytically neglected, and it was in need of robust understanding. So what we did was, after 300 literature reviews, we disaggregated cultural diversity into 4 distinct pillars: into a worldview. And we use the word worldview as a way of being able to make sense of all living things around us, whether it be as, whether you might be as a Christian or a Buddhist, or you might say I'm Muslim, but I'm a Shafi'i, which is a branch of Sunni, or you might say, you're an atheist or a humanist or even a vegan. We have a database of, I think it's around 8,200 now. And then the second pillar was country of birth. And we developed our own methodology and set of criteria for this, which is somewhat different to the United Nations. And why? Because when we first started to deploy Diversity Atlas, our data analytics platform in East Asia, it felt like we had 25 million angry Taiwanese. So I didn't sleep for 2 days. And the guy said, well, we can go to university and that could work it out for us. I went to university and they said they needed 6 months. So I just didn't sleep for 2 days. And I quickly came up with a methodology which went like this. If you're self-governing or you have your own currency, or using the currency of a UN security member, or recognized by at least 2 UN member states, then we're going to define you as a country. And that allowed us to just expand that database a little bit. Then we have a language, a database of 11,200 languages, dialects and speech communities, and then also 8,500 ancestral groups and cultures that people can identify with. And then what we do is we start to intersect this against a whole range of other demographic dimensions, so we can start to now get a sense of how that cultural diversity plays out in an organization. And then we can start to look at what's happening internally, but also externally. So global organizations that we're working with now are beginning to realize that if you want to do this work effectively of diversity, and you really want to create sustainability, if you focus on your environment, that will drive the type of diversity you need to have in your organization. It will drive the intersectionality in your organization. But if you just focus internally without thinking of your environment, you will almost disappear. And we see that a lot of the companies that we are working with, major tech companies across the globe, they understand their customers better than the customers understand themselves. They know what the customers are going to buy before the customers, have worked out what they're going to buy, but they don't understand themselves. But this idea of self-ID is coming up again and again and again. And we know that it's extremely controversial, especially after the recent events in Melbourne. But how often do people feel excluded? How often do people feel otherized, when they're completing surveys? And you can see there a testimonial from someone who completed the survey who said, I feel like I don't exist. I feel like I'm invisible, when she completed the Australian census, because there was only one category for her, mainland Southeast Asia. This woman came from Myanmar. She was a Kachin person. And in Myanmar, there's more than 110 languages and 134 ethnic groups. So how can we now start to understand identity through inclusive data sets, and which can start to allow us to apply these intercultural frameworks, anthropological lens to this work, where we can start to foster greater understanding of the other. So what are we trying to do with our organization? And I think all organizations need to do is this limited data, and how to interrupt this limited data cycle, which is leading to, language barriers, poor communication, lack of being able to retain staff, disconnect with business opportunities, underutilized investment. So we can now start to move towards these inclusive data sets that can now start to inform a whole range of strategies out there. And in my opinion, this is why a lot of strategies out there fail, because they're making the assumption that everyone is starting from the same place, not only socially, but culturally. So the more data we have, the better. So what our platform has been able to do is, if you compare it to other census, has this huge database, which we're calling the global database of humanity. And we have a network of contributors that are now starting to feed into this database, which can now start to capture cultural diversity, the 4 pillars that make it up, and then how that can start to be used, to inform a whole range of strategies in organizations. So we're starting to apply this multifactorial analysis, which then can be applied to, to having greater impact and measurement. I'm coming now towards the end of my 20 minutes, and I wanted to now end with what the title of today's show was. And this is a slogan that I developed, Diversified We Grow, for a UN campaign in 2013. And I had the opportunity to present this to a whole lot of heads of state and directors of ministries of culture. And, the stimulus for this slide was really interesting, because I used to conduct a choir called Canto Coro. And Canto Coro, we used to perform this song called El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido, the people united shall never be defeated. And everyone in that choir was pretty left-leaning, and I knew where they all stood. And there's highly educated people. And for me, it wasn't enough about what your political conviction was. For me, it was about, what are the challenges that are facing humanity now? How can we start to come together, regardless of our political convictions, and start to solve these global challenges? Why? Because when we start to bring diversity and focus on diversity of thought, we create greater touch points. And we know from a myriad of studies how diversity of thought leads to innovation. When I developed this slogan, I was thinking of the new numerical system we use today, from 0 to 9. This wasn't one culture giving this. This was Persian, Hellenic, Hindu thought, Arabic thought coming together to give something to humanity, which we're still using 1,000 years later. I was thinking of the bionic eye and how the convergence of so many different disciplines have come together to give something to humanity, which would have seemed almost impossible 1,000 years ago. I'm now going to play the slogan, and that will be the end of my presentation. Okay.
Every person, every culture is a sum of human experience. Our history has shown that progress is possible through interaction and cooperation. Working together in an interconnected and intercultural age is the next frontier of our new and exciting world. Multiracial, multi-ethnic, multifaceted, multi-talented, multicultural. We must acknowledge the value of each unique culture by engaging, exciting, and enticing the next generation through intercultural understanding in communities, in the arts, in the media, in business, and in education. Greatness was not achieved by any one culture. Greatness was born of the human experience. Divided we fall, united we stand, diversified we grow.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of you for being such an attentive audience. And just one last slide. This is the mathematical formula that underpins Diversity Atlas, and is able to let organizations let them know what their diversity rating is. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. What a fantastic presentation. And I agree that that all the audience would have been enlightened with this wonderful presentation. Thank you, Peter. Well, I'll take the chair privilege to kickstart some questions with you. And of course, I invite everyone to put your questions in the chat box. Peter, you reflected on the data-driven understanding of cultural diversity in general. But do you think sometimes, I'm very much a data person, but I think that at times the data do not capture the lived experiences of the people. And in Australia, I've seen that that although we we call ourselves a technologically advanced nation, we do have a piece of story that has to be told, the truth telling, the courage of recognizing the historical and the systemic racism that has existed before. You reflected an American case of racism being there in their charter. We also must reflect an Australian White Australia policy, which has been part of our system for such a long time. So I think in terms of data does, tell us, it gives us a panorama of the things, but we must also reflect on how the data intersects and interacts with lived experiences of the people. And of course, the history is an important piece. What would be your reflection on this, Peter?
Well, I totally agree. I think when we're looking at data, we need to see how it does intersect with experience. And I think you've pinpointed on something extremely valuable. We see how a lot of surveys out there at the moment, they're focusing on experience, but they're not focusing on how that experience intersects with all these different ranges of, demographics that, I highlighted that we pick up in our platform. And I think that's really important, because if we can start to do that, then we can start to develop a whole range of strategies that can start to focus on where is that discrimination? What are there particular groups that are experiencing more discrimination than others? And if so, why are they experiencing? And how does that intersect even in terms of class, in terms of where people may sit within an organization? So we can start to create greater, equity.
Absolutely. And I also want to highlight the point that you raised about the cultural diversity and language and linguistic diversity. I recently came back from a trip to Indonesia and India, and I realized that every 30 kilometers, you have a different language, a different culture, different people, different cuisine and food. And despite that diversity, they've been able to maintain the diversity in its totality. What can we do as a country in Australia to really preserve the cultural and linguistic diversity, which we have lost over time in terms of our linguistic diversity? You rightly talked about languages that we have lost from their Aboriginal background. So what can we do to revive those languages?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So I guess you're referring to the Indigenous languages, and there was and I made reference to the 700 languages and speech communities that were here before Europeans arrived. Some of them we're never going to be able to bring back. Now, I know there's huge movements at the moment to go beyond the 15. I think there's about 15 languages which are being taught in a lot of the regional remote settings, but it's to start to pick up some of those dormant languages where grandparents speak the languages. The children don't, but the grandchildren are now being taught those languages. So they're starting to, foster relationships between grandparents and grandchildren, so they can start to revive some of those languages. Because when a language is lost, there's so much information that is lost with that language too. There's a way of thinking that can inform other aspects of humanity. And I often say that, knowledge is based on the diversification of ideas and thinking. So, when we can, and how that leads to innovation and how that may solve some of the challenges that we're experiencing at the moment. I know that the government also invests in a lot of the migrant languages here. So migrants come here and they want to continue, their languages. What generally happens after 2 or 3 generations is people start to gravitate towards the cultural hegemony. And this happens right across the world. But I think there's movements now to recognize the value in being able to foster greater linguistic diversity, because, language is intrinsically connected to, to culture, and in many ways, even religion as well.
Oh, absolutely. 100% agree there, Peter. But there's a question from Ulmik, a fellow Rotarian from Virginia. And he talks about, in prior organizations, I've witnessed diversity in teams, both the strengths and the challenges for a high performance team. What studies and data can you point to on the benefits and challenges, difficulties of diversity in a team?
Yeah, that's a really great point that you make there, because often people think that diversity is, strength. Yes, it is strength. Diversity leads to, organizations which are more diverse can be 6 times more innovative. They can be 6 times more adaptive and reflective to change. They can be 37% more profitable. In some cases, they can be up to 300 or 400% more profitable. There's so many studies out there, but diversity is inherently not a good thing if it's not managed. So organizations need to really understand diversity. And what I keep on saying is we don't understand diversity in its entirety. And this is one of the reasons why I tried to get you to think today about the metrics that underpin diversity, because there aren't many organizations that are doing this nuanced work. We're the only ones, hence why, Amazon had been following my work for the better part of 2 years. And initially when they approached me, I thought they were trying to sell me cloud services. And little did I realize they were interested in Diversity Atlas. And ended up meeting with 90 of their staff right across the whole globe. And then now they recognize the value that this can bring to their organizations, because when they do the survey and they do Diversity Atlas survey, they also recognize that when people don't answer the question, that is invaluable data in and of itself, because that tells a story that people might not be feeling psychologically or culturally safe. So what work can they start to do to start to make people feel safer? And what we've noticed over the last 2 years is that prefer not to answer in certain categories is started now to go down from like 29% all the way down to 21% in some of the large global organizations that we're working with. But staff are also recognizing the value of being able to participate in a survey like this. Why? Because it starts to deepen the engagement between management and the staff. So it can start to lead to floating days. It can start to, staff are now being recognized, engagement through newsletters. People can start to now bring more aspects of their self to work where they couldn't beforehand, and they start to feel safer. So that starts to lead to greater retention. I've got a whole list of studies that are out there. There's a myriad of them, and I'm happy to send those through in the next day or so. David, I think you've got your hand up.
President David.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Peter. That was one of the most intense 45 minutes I've had in months.
Hey,
I feel like I've had a crash PhD course in something that was really
well, you know what's interesting, David, that you say that. Because I've been working in this space, really, I often say to people, ever since I started to work as a conductor composer, there was always a common thread there, and that was to build global harmony through intercultural action. And I'm on a mission to really drive that 10% that I talked about that's spent on dealing with the cost of conflict, which is more than $10 trillion. I'm on a mission that over a 15-year period to reduce that down to by $1 trillion. And I think we can do it, because if we can start to understand diversity as a metric, we can start to develop greater intervention strategies. But I know you've got a question and a comment, please.
No, I understand exactly where you're coming from and the power of the metrics. I mean, this is something that we've learned through IEP. If you can't measure something, how can you plan? And how do you know what works and what doesn't work? But I have a question for you. You had mentioned earlier in your talk that every encounter is racialized. That really struck a chord with me, because one of the things that appears to me to be driving this culture apart, and many others, I think, is the rise of what we call identity politics.
Yeah, politicization of identity, absolutely.
And I can understand that part of your message would be that every subgroup, and you've articulated thousands of them, every subgroup needs to be recognized. But identity politics seems to be about every subgroup demanding special recognition. I want you to recognize that I'm different to all of you, and moreover, that my suffering is worse than your suffering.
Yeah.
And part of what really drives me spare now is this proliferation of subgroups of identity, each claiming special status and each requiring special treatment. And I think that is really fraying the patience of a lot of very good people. And I just was wondering how you manage, on the one hand, the need for the recognition of difference, which I accept, but the proliferation of specialness that is being demanded. How do we manage that problem?
Yeah. So our organization likes to focus on the data, and we also focus on cultural diversity. I think the limitation with a lot of these groups and I'm seeing a lot of this too now, where people are entering this DEI space, and they're entering it because of it's my experience is bigger than yours, so I should be working, in this area. And a lot of people, I'm even seeing a trend where, to some extent, a lot of people see DEI work as almost as a Trojan horse to espouse their social justice perspectives. And I think there's a danger there now, where we've seen a massive polarization that's taking place, and it's embedded throughout the whole West, and not only the West, it's starting to spread right across the whole world. I think what we need to do is take a more nuanced approach, because what's happening with a lot of this work is they're just seeing identity through or the politicizing identity through just one attribute of identity, and identity is made up of many different attributes. So we need to now start to see how these political groups, and they need to start to see themselves, and we need to educate them the importance of anthropology, and that you cannot see this work that you're doing or what you're on about through just your lens, because it's a lot more complex than that. Because if you start to do that, then what you start to do is you create a whole range of unintended consequences, as we've starting to see in many parts of the world. If we look at the UAE, for example, 65% of women now make up the public sector there, 50% in Qatar, because they deliberately went ahead and said, we need more women. But what they didn't do was, when they did this work, they didn't look at what the impact of that work would be. So I don't know if I've fully answered your question here, David, and I probably need to sort of take it on notice and come back to you, because I've sort of, my mind is racing in a whole range of different directions. But I do believe that we need to start to foster greater inclusion, and we need to focus on what our commonalities are, rather than what the differences are, and recognize that this that identity politics in many ways is not a data-driven approach to take this work. Because when you start to focus on data, then the identity politics and the politics starts to fall by the wayside, because you're starting to realize that everyone is in this, and everyone needs to have a voice in this work, not just one particular group.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, David. Peter, there's another question in the chat box from our president-elect, Charlie Allen. He says, your observations of Australian census data is concerning. The census is used so often to inform policy and resourcing decisions. The limitations of census data would suggest decisions are being made on flawed data. Is this a concern you share?
Yeah, 100%. I would like all census across the world, because what we've been trying to do with our work is develop this global classification of how we understand humanity. And the great thing about having a client like Amazon is they can exert incredible influence across the world. And we've done so much work in this space, like not only the amount of literature reviews, the extensive travel that I've done, sitting on committees and advisors who I've been working with to try to develop, these inclusive data sets. If someone is not If a census is making decisions when someone's not being included, they're going to be left out at the end of the day. It's really as simple as that. And if you're not including those people, well, they're going to feel resentment. They're going to feel like they're not being valued. They're going to feel like they're not being counted. So how do you develop any type of strategy, that can make people feel included if you don't have inclusive data sets?
Thank you, Charlie. Lurie, you have a question. Go ahead, Lurie.
Yeah, Peter, thanks for the great presentation. It definitely raises lots of questions around, but probably mine will be a bit related to David's one, is about the workplace. Let's see, in the workplace, how we distinguish between when we recognize people, their diversity, and when it becomes a privilege, based on whatever cultural characteristics is there, and how your data can help resolve that. Because normally, okay, how far do we go in recognizing, and when it becomes as treatment to a special group rather than recognizing? And probably in addition to that is that like, for example, when people engage in whatever way in a consultation, and when in this circumstance with diversity, a consultation would require an action not just saying, yep, you've been consolidated, that's good, we'll be doing this the way we actually think, or actually other stakeholders think. So how do we deal with those things? Because with that many groups, that might be a little bit difficult to draw a line or 10 lines or
of course.
circles.
Yuri, is that how you pronounce your name? So yeah.
Oh,
Yuri,
good, I got it.
But, excellent, points that you've made, and I often say to people that this work is highly sophisticated work. You don't just do a survey and you click your fingers and overnight it happens. If you think of marketing technologies 30 years ago, it was just trying to work out what the age of people were and maybe what the gender. Now it's become so complex and sophisticated that big fashion labels know that if a person's got a certain type of colored eye, they know what type of colors are going to appeal to them. Okay, so we're at the very early stage of this, this work. So with a lot of the large clients that we're working with, we'll come up with a strategy, and we might only come up with 3 recommendations because they can't do all this work overnight. But it's about also developing targets, and it's about the intent. But let me give you one example. When I was addressing some of the side events at the UN General Assembly last year, a lady had got up and said to me, I work for an organization that gives scholarships to African Americans. And she said, because we don't take a nuanced approach, and because in the US they conflate ethnicity and race, and they've got only like 6 categories, it's perpetuating difference and exclusion and so many other things. She said, let me tell you what happens in our organization. She goes, I know for a fact that more than 90% of the scholarships are going to first, second, and third generation African Americans. Less than 10% are going to African Americans that came out by the transatlantic slavery route. So a platform, when you have this nuanced data, you can start to see where that inequity might start to lie, because now, and this is what clients find when they see the data, it's like a crystal ball. They go, oh my God, I didn't know I had people in my organization that spoke 7 languages. I didn't know people in my organization that we have so many women in our organization that have got masters and PhDs, and they're not moving above middle management in our organization. Some organizations we're working with, global ones, are saying, oh, we're extremely diverse. And one big NGO that we were working with said, yeah, we're extremely diverse. And the truth was they were. They had people from all over the world. But when we intersected that against religion, we noticed that 95% of the people were Christians. Less than 5% were not Christian. And they had an idea to what extent that it was pretty weighted towards Christianity, but they didn't know to that extent. And so now they're starting to look at their recruitment strategies, because they know that a lot of affinity bias takes place. So they're starting to really interrogate some of the structures and the systems and the processes with how they recruit. So now this is informing recruitment. Some organizations that we work with, thought we've got 7% of people of our workforce that identify with Islam. We had no idea it was that big. So now they're deepening their engagement. They're having floating days with them. They're finding those staff are staying longer with them. They've got prayer rooms for them. They acknowledge them at certain types of the year. So when you start to see how this equity plays out, it doesn't mean, once again, it doesn't mean that we're going to fix this problem overnight. It's about what's the strategy that we need to put in place so we can start to make a difference. But some small organizations we've worked with, which are like 500, like an organization that we're working with here in Australia, which had about 15 orchestras, they recognized that they had so many people from East Asian background, yet they had no donor from East Asia, and they weren't really using any of these East Asians as soloists. So now they're starting to use them as soloists, and then now got donors that are coming in from the parents of these children. They're starting to tap into these communities, but they also recognize that within this group of 500 students, they had only one student that put down that they had an African heritage. So they're now working with government to develop pathways so they can start to get students that can start to come into these orchestras. That's not going to happen overnight. That's going to probably take maybe 10 years, but this is a way of being able to build role models and start to really foster capacity in certain communities.
Thank you, Peter. I think in the interest of time, we will proceed with the next part of our this. So can I invite President David Hirsch to say a vote of thanks. David, over to you.
You're on mute, David.
David, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, well, my vote of thanks could go on for 15 minutes. But I won't do that. Can I, Peter, this has really been a very enlightening hour now. I wonder if you would just allow me to make one point and ask Peter's comment on it, because it could be a short answer. And that is coming back to the issue of music. When I realized what your background was and that you were bringing people together and you had this orchestral conductor aspect to your life, it occurred to me that you're basically an Australian equivalent of Daniel Barenboim, who of course has the orchestra in Israel that is full of Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah.
And
he was the chief conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. I spent about 3 months observing him in Chicago when he was leading the orchestra back in 93, 94, around then.
Yeah. But the thing about an orchestra full of diverse people is that they have one objective, and that is to play the music well. But somebody else has written the music.
That's right.
And what I'm wondering about is, what is the music that we culturally need to play in order to work together well? We can't just go shouting about our individuality. We have to put our shoulders to the grindstone and work together for something. So what's the togetherness that you think is needed to bring people to work together, like music is for an orchestra? What is it for the rest of the world? Is it the global challenge that we need to all work on?
It is the global challenge, because the numbers speak at the end of the day, and I think it all comes back to education. I ultimately think we're going to need some sort of a monumental shift in human evolution. Why? Because this biological mechanism that evolved in us over 200,000 years, called fear, is what drives discrimination at the end of the day. But I think we need to all sing from the same page, and that is that cultural diversity is humanity's greatest asset, and we're not doing enough to mine it, to exploit it, to benefit humanity at the end of the day.
Well, I think that's probably a really good note to end this on. And you've covered so much ground here. I'm not even going to try to go over it, but I do like the fact that you have brought us back to the data and away from just our knee-jerk impressions, all of which would be culturally mediated, whether we recognize it or not. And you've invited us to look at some objective information. And I think even from the few examples that you've given us, you've exposed areas where we probably wouldn't have thought that there was meaningful difference. And I think that's been extremely enlightening to us. And I do wish that this could go on, and I would like to make sure that you do speak to Rotary again much sooner than 13 years from now, because I think this is such an important talk, and there should be, and it should be a larger audience should have a benefit of what you've just been saying. Yeah. But on behalf of the few of us that are here, can I just extend my thanks to you for really a remarkable presentation, and one that's going to stay with us, I'm sure, for a very long time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to Charlie and Dr. Sonu and everyone else today. Thank you.
Myself. Thank you, David. Thank you, Peter. I think no words can suffice the amount of information that has been shared with us today. And I think all of us become more wiser than we were half an hour or 45 minutes before. So thank you, Peter, for an excellent presentation and giving us a brief idea of how diversity can be the repository of success for us as Australian. Well, I just want to give members of the club a brief note on what's coming up next. So we've got on 27th of March, we got the climate change challenges with Christina Eisenbach. And so please join us. It'll be a Zoom only meeting. And then on the 4th of April, Jeff Roberts is speaking about, does Sydney have a great future? So really fantastic speakers in lineup for the next couple of weeks. So please do come back to the Rotary Club of Sydney. We've got amazing events lined up. Now, on the final note, I think we had a treatise of basically diversity and how it influences our people and value systems, so on and so forth. I just want to end this meeting with a note from one of our great peacemakers of all time, Mahatma Gandhi, as you've known. And he says that our ability to reach unity in diversity will be the beauty and the test of our civilization. And I think Gandhi was so right. And this was spoken in 1925 when the British were still on the Indian shores. In 1947, the British left. And he fought a memorable battle with the British in a non-violent way from South Africa all the way to India. He was a barrister by training, but an incident in South Africa triggered that passion to self-determination. And he came back to India to take the battle on after taking the British on in South Africa. I think that that diversity was embedded in Gandhi in the way he tackled the problem. And we, us as a community of Rotarians, have so much of Gandhi in us, so much of Tagore in us, and so much of Peter in us. We had a wonderful guest speaker today. So thank you, Peter, once again for your generosity to share your wisdom. And thank you, Rotarians, for joining us today, and guests for joining us today as well. On that note, I declare the meeting closed and look forward to seeing you in the next meeting.